There are stories that history swallows whole, not because they are too small to matter, but because they are too dangerous to survive. Somewhere in the low country, South Carolina, on a plantation that no longer bears a name on an official map, there was a man who sat at his master's table of reason a California for nearly 11 years. He ate from the same chain. He drank from the same crystal. The same hand that served the white family seated around him served him as well. And not one birth, not the overseer, not the neighbors, not the visitor ministers, not the county sheriff, offered a word about it. Not one. For decades, the people who know of this arrangement refused to speak of it. The few records that touch on the subject were removed from the county court has sometime around 1879, during a fear that local stellarchy was not entirely accidental. Waterman or fragments, a letter here, a ledger entry there, a cynical deposition buried inside a probate dispute that no one thought look at it for over 60 years. When finally based together, those fragments revealed not a story of cadence. Not a story of redemption. Some serve for more unsettler than either, a story of carry large sober says, sober ancient, and so quickly disaster that still defies the explanation. Before we continue with the story of Rolfos and the man who sat at his table. If you've never been to this channel before, welcome. If you have, you already know what kind of bliss this is. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and listen the comments or enjoy your lesson from today, because the story, I promise you, is one you will not forget. Now, let us go back to the beginning, the Carolina country, to the year 1847, and the man who entrefid in 1847 was named Rolfos. He was 43 years old that year, a second-generation planter whose father had come down from Virginia with a small inheritance and enormous ability for land. Howell had inherited both the land and the ability, and over the course of 20 years he had expanded the field from its original 400 acres nearly twice that size, being a number of buses as their owners fell into the tornado that years. He was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He did not take pleasure in suffering for its own sake, did not drink himself into rages, did not make a spectacle of his society. By the standards of his time and place, he was considered a reasonable man, a practical man, a man who understood that a business ran on efficiency, and that efficiency required a certain kind of order. His wife, Margaret Foss, was the daughter of a race planter from Georgetown. She was a quiet woman, not cold, exactly, but intent. The kind of person who expressed strong feelings only in brief, if at all. She had Howell 3 children, a son named Thomas, who was 16 in 1847 and already became to take over the management of the plantation, a daughter named Clara, who was 14 and being educated at home by a succession of tutors from tourists, and a younger son named William, who was 9 and still largely in the care of the household staff. The household staff at Crefid consisted of approximately 14 slave people who worked inside the main house or in the immediate domestic sphere, cooker, cleaner, launderer, tender the cords, driver the carriages, care for the children. Beyond them there were somewhere between 80 and 100 slave people who worked the field, the courthouse, the stables, and the ferries at builders that made up the working infrastructure of the plantation. The exact number fluctuated, as it did almost plantations of the size, births, deaths, sales, and the occasional hierarchy arrangement with neighbor properties. Among all these people, there was one man whose position to feed the free category that the plantation system had created in him. His name was Kerto. He had no surname, or rather, he had no surname that anyone at Crefid acknowledged. He was simply Kerto, and had been since the day he arrived at his plantation as a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, purchased at a church vocation in the spring of 1832. No one knew exactly where he had come from before that. The auction records listed him as having been part of a lot sold by the state of East planter in Clet district, but the state records themselves were incomplete, and the trail and code there. What was known about Kerto by the time our story begins and runs to this. He was approximately 27 or 28 years old. He was tall, unusually tall for the year, well over 6 feet, with a lean, un killer build and hands that seemed almost too large for his body, the kind of hands that belonged someone who had spent years doing precise, demanding work. He had a face that people remembered that Bill built exactly way, not conventionally handsome, not thicker than any obvious way, but with a quality strength, a quality of action that made you feel, when he looked at you, that he was seen considerably more than you intended show. He had been for the past several years the head refer at the field, then slav man responsible for overseeing the work of the field hands, for maintaining the best and quality of the cod harvest, for serving as the primary intermediary between the Slavs community and the wet overseer, a man named Tofrik, who had held the position for 6 years and who was considerably less competent at his job than the man nominally beneath him. This was not unusual arrangement on many large plantations throughout the country. The head refer was the person who actually understood how the operation worked, on which fields were ready to pick and which needed another week, on which workers were reliable and which needed watching, on other rhythms and the weather and the soil and a way that no wet overseer, no relief from somewhere else, could possibly replicate. The differ was indispensable, and indispensability in the plantation economy was a form of barrier, limit, constraint, always conditional, but real. Cato had understood this from a very young age. What no one at Creed fully understood, not yet, was the precise nature and extent of what Cato had been doing was that understandable for the better part of a decade. The arrangement began, as best as the new one could later reconstruct, in the autumn of 1847. The cod harvest that year had been extraordinary. The long summer runs had come at exactly the right intervals, the season that stead made so August, and the boys had opened full and wet because of refilled at the field. By the time the beck was done and the cod had been digened and bed and sent out to tourists, Orelfoss was looking at a booth that exceeded the niece he had seen in the previous 5 years combined. He was beyond measure a wealthy man that autumn, wealthier than he had been years, and a mod that has hustled described, in the careful and coach of people who had rented their master's temperament like a barometer, as expensive. It was in this mode of expansiveness that Orelfoss did something that no one at Creed had ever seen him do before. He infatuated then with him. Not in the kitchen, not in the officers' quarters, at the main table, in the dining room of the house, was the family self-related and the candles lit and the household staff muffled quietly around the edges of the room with the breakfast sensibility that domestic service required. Then Ftish was delivered by Thomas Foss, who was 15 and who clearly found the entire business uncomfortable in a way he could not quite articulate. He came to the courthouse, where Cato was finishing the last of the season tallies, long columns of figures and a ledger that Cato kept with a prestige that the Netflix had long since sought to pretend to understand, and stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. My father would see you at Sabbath night, Thomas said. At the house? Cato looked up from the ledger. His expression did not change. Yes, sir, he said. That was all. No question, no hesitation, no visible surprise. He closed the ledger, sat down his pen, and that even revealed at the dining room of the man has at the precisely that supper was served, where the clean's close he owned, his hand scrubbed the rest. He sat at his table. He ate. He spoke once about. And what he said was, Bevillicant of the one has had served to later describe the even in any detail, measured, precise, and entirely without the performance of the affairs that characterize most interactions between enslaved people and their slavers in that time and place. He did not shuffle. He did not look at the floor. He answered Orelfoss's questions about the horse to the same directions he would have used to the overseer. And when Orel asked him a question about the soil composition of the Easter fields, a question that Dentifric could not have answered, Cato answered it in a way that made Orelfoss sit back in his chair and looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Markert Foss said almost answer so at the meal. Thomas was Cato with an expression that hovered somewhere between fascination and ease. Carerer kept her eyes on her plate. Young William, who had not been told anything unusual was happening, simply ate his supper and speaks yours. When the meal was over, Orelfoss thanked Cato for his work that season and told him he would receive additional cash of provisions for his household. Cato thanked him in return, stood, and left. The next evening, Cato was at the table again. No one had invited him a second time. He simply rebuilt at the same hour, in the same clothes, and sat in the same chair. Horolfos looked at him for a moment when he entered the room. And this was the detail that the household served to instead could never quite explain. If years later, Horolfos nodded, as if this were expected, as if it had been incredible. And so it continued, night after night, through the autumn of 1847 and into the winter. Kerto built at the table of Horolfos. Hayat was the family. He participated in the conversation and fitted in a man sealed when he was not. He was served by the same household staff who served the Foss family, and those staff members, who were themselves enslaved, who had their own complex and carefully maintained hierarchies and relationships, did not speak of it. Not each other, not the overseer, not the feed hands. The sales around the arrangement was, from the very beginning, absolute. Word reached the neighbor plantations within weeks. It could not have been other ways. The low country was a small world, and the movement of information through it was as constant and as difficult to stop as the tide flow through the marsh. Neighbors held. Ministers held. The county sheriff, a man named Old Sabrod, held. And not one of them said a word at Horolfos about it. This was perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. The society built on the absolute enforcement of racial hierarchy, a society in which the act of a black man sitting at a white man's table was not merely a social time crash but a challenge at the entire architecture of the world as it existed in its هلم برشن 1847. The silence of the community was not natural. It was not comfortable. It was the silence of people who had said, for reasons that did not discuss openly, that whatever was happening at Crefeld was something that did not look at directly. The question that no one asked at loud, the question that sat at the center of a freezer like a stone at the bottom of a dark river, was simple, what do you know? To understand what you know, you have to understand something about the world he had grown. He had lived at Crefeld as a boy in 1832, at a moment when the plantation was still in the process of establishing itself. Horolfos's father, Edmund Foss, was still less than a harder man than his son by most accounts, and one was a more direct relationship with the feelings that underpinned the system had built his life upon. Edmund Foss had come down from Virginia with money and ambition, a set of beliefs about the natural order of things that he had with the certainty of a man who has never had a casual question. Kerto had watched Edmund Foss for 3 years before the road mandate of a fever in the summer of 1835. He had watched the way the plantation worked, not just the coat, not just the field, but the whole machinery of it, the way information moved, the way decisions were made, the way beer was distributed and maintained and occasionally, carefully, transferred. He had watched Horolfos inherit that machinery and become so it make it his own. And he had become from a fairly rigid sense, not in any dramatic or conspiratorial sense, not at first. He learned because learn was what he did, the way some people breathe or sleep or eat. He learned the coat, the soil, the seed, the weather, the time of a freezer. He learned the ledgers, watching over the shoulder of the overseer who preceded them to Frick, a man named Corland, who was careless with his books and who did not notice the boy who swept the floor of the coat has been closed shut to the columns of figures. He learned trade, not from any teacher, not through any formal arrangement, but through a process of patient, solitary observation that took years and that he never spoke of to anyone. He learned other sinners too, sinners that were ordered categories. He learned the shape of Horolfos's deaths. This was not difficult if you know where to look and had the precious to look carefully. The plantation economy of the antebellum South was built on cred, on loans from tourist factors, on defenses against future harvests, on the complex web of financial obligations that connected the free planter and the locate to free other planter and to the merchant houses that financed them all. Horolfos was no kasabish. He had managed a factor named Cornelius Hayek, who operated of a counter-hasonist based church. He had managed a landed to Beaufort. He had borrowed against the value of several of his enslaved workers to finance the purchase of the Easter fields in 1843, a transactions that had left him for a period of nearly 2 years in a position of considerable financial vulnerability. Cato knew about all of this. He had basically zero for years from fragments, offered conversations, ledger entries came through open doors, the careful reader of documents that passed through the courthouse in the ordinary course of business. He had sampled a picture of how الفوس's financial situation that was, by 1847, more complete and more accurate than any how الفوس himself could have bulldozed from memory. But that was not the most important thing Cartono. The most important thing Cartono had nothing to do with money. It had to do with a man named Rajendasto. Rajendasto was a planter from Kalat district, the same district where Cato had originated before the auction choice. He was a man of approximately how الفوس's age, and he and Hall had known each other since childhood. Their families have been connected through the overlapping social networks of the local planter class. They were not close friends. There was something between them that had always prevented genuine closeness, some odd tension rivalry that neither man spoke of directly, but they moved in the same circles, attended the same church Beaufort, sat on the same county committees. In the spring of 1846, Rajendasto had come to Crefeld on what he described as a social visit. He had stayed for 3 days. On this record day of his visit, something had happened, something that had taken place in the study of the man's late at night, after the household had retired. Cato had been awake. He was off work late, working in the courthouse by lamplight on the accounts. The courthouse was close enough to the man's that sun carried on a still lit through the open windows. He had heard what happened in that study. He had not told anyone, not then, not for a long time afterward. He had some filled toy with the same careful prestige with Sheffield or freezer siren. And he had waited. The dishes, in the world Carton habit, was not a virtue. It was a survival strategy. It was the only form of barrier available to a person has possessed, the bar of none who not to act, of how the sums of another until the moment when it would matter most. By the autumn of 1847, the Holst sees, that moment had arrived. If you've been listening closely, you already sense that what Cato heard through that open window was something that how الفوس could not afford have known. And you're right. But the full shape of it, the precise nature of what passed between those two men that study, and what it meant for everyone at Crefeld, that is something we will come. Because to understand it properly, you need to understand first what Cato did with what he know, and had he did it, and with entire community festi, Helen Burst's clock the zero. And that story is considerably more complicated than it might be. This second city belongs here naturally, at this moment of the flesh. And so, if the story is already bulled at you, if you're already asking yourself what Cato heard through that window and what it cost him to keep it, then you know exactly what kind of channel this is. Like this video? Leave us a comment with your theory, or do you think Cato know? And subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right here. نبات Crefeld, and the winter of 1847. The arrangement at the dinner table had by December of that year become something that the household had served into its routines as always about it serves a project, not comfortably, not without cost, but with a kind of calm adaptation that was in its own way more disturbing than open conflict would have been. The household staff served Cato that command. Thomas set his stubborn sales, Ocean. Margaret Foss had developed the habit of directing her conversation exclusively toward her husband or her children, as if Cato's presence at the table were a weather condition, something to be endured rather than acknowledged. Dent Frick, the overseer, had said nothing at all. This was perhaps the most telling sale of all, because Frick was not a man who was naturally inclined toward sales. He was a man who expressed his opinions freely and frequently, who had strong views about the proper order of things on a plantage, and who was not shy to enforce them. The fact that he had looked at this church at Crefeld's dinner table and chose deliberately to say nothing, this spoke something. It spoke the fact that Frick, whatever his limitations, was not so bad. He had looked at this church and made a calculation, and the calculation had told him to keep his mouth shut. What that calculation was based on, Frick never said. But there were people at Crefeld who had their suspicions. Another thing left the community, the reaction to those no business was complex and alleged was that the weak members of the household could not have fully understood, if they had tried. There was certainly a decay of the sheer audacity of what Kirto had ability managed to arrange for himself was not lost on anyone who understood or the whole of them. But there was also a need, and some that in some quarters shaded into resentment. Kirto had always been a figure of authority within the community, they had referred, the man who stood between the feed hands and the officer's bar. But this authority had always been understood as a form of service, a mediation on behalf of the community. What he was doing felt different. It felt like something done for himself alone. There was a woman who worked in the man's sketch, who had been at Crefeld longer than Kirto. She had come with the plantation at the man first established it, and she was, in the formal hierarchy of the Slavic community, a figure of considerable standard. She was perhaps 45 years old in 1847, a small, combat woman with a way of moving through the kitchen that suggested she was always synonymous beside of whatever she was currently doing. She had chosen an irritable arrangement developed from the beginning, and she had said nothing about it to anyone. Not because she hadn't said, but because she was, in her role, as patient as Kirto. When even in January of 1848, she found the opportunity to be to Milan. It was late, after the summer sinners had been cleared, and Kirto was crossing the yard between the manhouse and the courthouse. Nor was at the well, drawn water for the morning's work. You know what you're doing, she said. It was not a question. I know what I'm doing, Kirto agreed. And when it's done, she asked, when whatever your work not is finished, what happens to the rest of us? Kirto was quiet for a moment. Then it was cold, the kind of cold that came off the motion January and settled into the bones, and his breath made small clashes in the doctors. Nothing changes for the rest of you, he said faintly. That's not what this is. Nor looked at him for a long moment. You sure about that? No, he said. But it's what I intend. She went back to down her water, and I went back to the courthouse, and neither of them spoke of it again. What Kirto intended, what he had been working toward was the vicious and precision that characterized the freeze and hated, was something that had known him in the vocabulary of 1848. It was not freedom exactly, or not only freedom. It was something more specific than that, and more dangerous. He intended survive Crefeld, not escape. Escape was a different kind of calculation, with different risks and different odds. Kirto had thought about it carefully and set aside. The geography of the low country was not favorable to escape. The marsh was impossible without a boat, and boats were watched. The roads north were long and dangerous, and a man of Kirto's height and beers would be remembered everywhere he stopped. The underground road existed, Kirto knew this in the way that only left people in the low country north, through suburbs and cold land and the occasional basis of someone who had been there the day before, but it was not a reliable mechanism, and it required a kind of trust in strangers that Kirto, who had rented this almost no one, found difficult to extend. No, what Kirto intended was something different. He intended to make himself so essential to the function of Crefeld, and to the personal security of all force, that the ordinary mechanism of the plantation system would be unable to show. He intended to construct, through years of careful work, a position so singular and so necessary that the question of his status, in slave or free, property or birth, would become, in practical terms, irrelevant. It was an audacious plan. It was in many ways an impossible plan. And it was overturned. The dinner table was not the beginning of it. The dinner table was a consequence, a feasible symptom of something that had been developed for years in the ledgers and the courthouse and the careful management of all forces financial affairs. Because what Kirto had done over the course of nearly a decade was make himself indispensable not just to the operation of the plantation but to the financial survival of its owner. He had done this and was that were individually unremarkable. He had caught errors in the factors against, whereas that, if left incorrected, would have caused horrible significant sums. He had identified, 3 years running, the optimal time for the horse that maximize the quality of the fiber and therefore the price it commanded choice. He had managed the labor force with a skill that kept the product steady and the kind of catastrophic breakdowns, illness, injury, the slow erosion of morale that could devastate a horse at a minimum. He had done all of this so that a make it explicit, was that a presented himself as the niece rather than a capable defender of his job. But Horolfoss was not a stupid man. He had noticed. And in the autumn of 1847, when the horse كمان the numbers were better than they had been years, he had made a calculation of his own. The calculation was this: Kerto was worth more to him at the table than in the field. Not in any sentimental sense, not that of gratitude or affection any of the softer emotions that later generations would sometimes project onto those arrangements, looking for some redemptive in a story that had very little redemption. It was a purely practical calculation. Kato's presence at the table, his participation in the conversations about the plantation's management, his access to information that Horolfoss needed, was worth more than whatever social cost the arrangement imposed. And the social cost, as it turned out, was manageable, because Horolfoss had some that made the neighbors and the ministers and the county sheriff elected to press the matter. He had agenda stock. Agenda stock had, in the spring of 1846, come to كفيد with a proposition. The proposition concerned a base of land, a parcel of approximately 200 acres that lay between كفيد the Serbandry and the edge of Hastock Souders and Clout district. The land was not particularly valuable in itself, it was low and marshy, difficult to cultivate, but it occupied a position that was strategically important to both plantations, control of access to a tidal creek that both properties used for the transport of cotton based the river London. Hastock wanted to buy it. He had been trained at bait for years from the widow of the man who had originally owned it, a woman and Amoras Delico, who was elderly and in decline health and who had, for reasons she never explained, consistently refused to sell. When Amoras Delico died in the winter of 1845, the land passed to her nephew, a young man named Philip Delico, who lived in Savannah and had no particular attachment to the low country or its complicated land arrangements. Hastock had approached him immediately, but Horolfoss had caught there first. He had purchased the Delico parcel in February of 1846, 2 weeks before Hastock's digital in Savannah met the offer. The price he had bid was fair, not extravagant, but fair, and the transaction was entirely legal. But Hastock had taken it as a personal friend, as if his field in the spring of that year had been ostensibly an attempt to negotiate some arrangement by which Hastock could gain access to the creek. The negotiation had not gone well. Horolfoss had been a bit firm, the land was his, the creek was his, and he had no interest in sharing either. Hastock had left after 3 days and a mod that the household staff at Crefid the 3 carefully as called. What had happened in the study on the second night of that visit was not worth any negotiation. What had happened in the study was this: Regent Hastock, in the crib of a rage that the whiskey he had been drunk for had not helped moderate, had said something at Horolfoss, something specific, something that concerned a transaction that had taken place several years earlier, a transaction for the sale of enslaved birds from Hastock Souders at a bear in Orleans, a transaction that had been recorded in the official documents as a voluntary sale but that had been, in fact, something considerably more complicated and considerably more legal. The details of what Hastock had said, the precise nature of the transaction he had described, and what it implied about his own conduct and about the conduct of at least other men in the county, were scenes that Kerto had heard through the open window of the court house on a still spring night in 1846. He had heard them clearly because Hastock had not been speaking quickly, and because the night had been warm and the windows of the study had been opened to catch whatever breeze came off the marsh. He had heard Hastock through Horolfoss, not with Phyllis. Hastock was not that kind of man, or at least not at that moment. He had threatened him with exposure. He had told Horolfoss that if the land dispute was not resolved in his favor, he would make certain information public. Information that concerned Horolfoss's father, Edmund, and a series of transactions that Edmund had conducted in the years before his death, transactions that had enforced the force of cash assertly legal documents related to the ownership and transfer of enslaved people. The falsification had been done to conceal a Edmund Foss had Odmani, Ekredil of money, Eman Virginie, and he had set that so a transaction that was, under the laws of Saskarlen, fraudulent. The transaction had been witnessed by Regenda Stocksozer, who had since died but who had left behind a replicant of what he had seen, mukend that Regenda possessed and was berbered dios. If the information became public, the legal consequences for Horror Foss, who had inherited those the plantation, arguably, the liability for his father's fraudulent transactions, or this year. The land could be seized. The debts could be called in. Crefeld, in the worst case, could be lost entirely. Horror Foss had listened to all of this in silence, and then he had said, very quickly, that he would think about it. Hastock had left the next morning, and Horror Foss had spent the following months thinking about it. Thinking about it was the focus. Methodically of a man who understood that he was in a very dangerous position and that his options were limited. What he had not known, what he could not have known, was that someone else had already heard the phrase Hastock had said, and had been thinking about it too. Ecto had spent the months between the spring of 1846 and the autumn of 1847 doing summers that required extraordinary patience and extraordinary nerve. He had been quickly, carefully, systematically gathered a free base of information he could find about the transactions that the Foss had conducted, the fraudulent ones, the ones that Hastock was written to expose. He had done this through the ledgers, through the correspondence that passed through the courthouse, through the careful reading of documents that Horror Foss kept in a lockbox in the study but that were occasionally bought for a first and brief intended. By the autumn of 1847, Keto know as much about Edmund Foss's fraudulent transactions as Reginald Hastock did, possibly more. And he knows something else, something that Hastock did not know and that Horror Foss did not know and that no one at Crefeld knew except Keto himself. He knew where the original documents were. Not Hastock's copy, the replicant that Hastock's father had left behind, but the originals, the actual falsified records, the ones that Edmund Foss had created and then had, believe that had was the same as destroyed. They were not destroyed. They were in a place that Keto had found years earlier in the course of his work in the courthouse, a place that Edmund Foss had used as a hiding spot and that his son had obtained for discovered. Keto had noticed them. He had simply not where they were unwanted. In the autumn of 1847, he had gone to Horror Foss. He had not gone with threats. He had not gone with demands. He had gone with information, specific, precise, carefully organized information about the state of Horror Foss's legal exposure and about what could be done to address it. He had led it, in the way, methodical way that characterized the phrase he did, exactly what he knew and exactly what he was prepared to do. And then he had made a proposal. The proposal was not complicated. In exchange for certain arrangements that included, but were not limited, a seat at the dinner table, Keto would help Horror Foss navigate the threat that Hastock represented. He would help him find a way to utilize it, using the information the documents that Keto had accessed. He would do this not because he had any loyalty to Horror Foss or any insistence in the survival of Crefeld as it currently existed, but because it served his own purposes to do so. Horror Foss had listened to all of this, and then he had done something that surprised Keto. He had laughed, not a warm laugh, not a nude laugh, a short, sharp sound that had more in common with a cough than with genuine laughter. And then he had said, "You've been planning this for a long time." "Yes, sir," Keto had said. "How long?" Keto had considered the question. "Since I was about 15, he said. Horror Foss had looked at him for a long moment, and then he had said, "All right." "Just that?" "All right." And the arrangement had begun. The winter of 1848 was called by low country standards, not the killer cold of the northern states, but a damp, temperature that settled into the odd plantage Hassan refused to leave. The fireplaces in the main rooms burned constantly, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the soot from the marsh to create an atmosphere that was, not so, suffocating. Thomas Foss had begun to drink. He was 10 by January of 1848, old enough to have formed a clear picture of what was happening at Crefeld, en innerst findet intolerable. He was not a cruel young man. He had his mother's content quality, her tendency filsness de blues at express them. But he had grown up in a world that had given a very subsucceed of expectations that that were direct, and what was happened that his father's notable feel at the fluent of those expectations and was that he could not articulate and could not ignore. He had tried once to beat his father about it. The conversation had been brief. It's a business arrangement, Horolfos had said. You don't need to understand it. I understand enough, Thomas had said. His father had looked at him with an expression that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not contempt, but some of that was almost pity. No, Horolfos had said quickly. You don't. Thomas had not raised the subject again. Instead, he had become subender as if away from the manhouse, at the tougher Beaufort, at the homes of neighbors, when you are that was not the danger of Scraffield. His Dernrek was not his fear, but it was noticed, and it was understood by those who noticed it as a symptom of something that no one wanted them directly. Clever Foss, who was often by this point, had developed a different response. She had become intensely, almost excessively brief. She was shocked at the dinner table with the fact that someone at south a basil, catalogue of his gestures, his orders, his silences, with the thrones that was, for a 15-year-old girl 1848, remarkable. She had become keeping a journal, a practice that her mother had encouraged as a suitable occupation for a young woman of her stage. But the journal had become something considerably more than a record of social cause than other observations. It had become a document of a free nuclear verso analytic field, written a hand that grew more precise and more analytical as the months passed. It was clear as journal that would eventually provide the most detailed account of what happened at the field in the years that followed. It was clear as journal that would be found 60 years later, taken the line of a traveling trunk in that of a Hassan Beaufort, found by a woman who was Clara's granddaughter, already to strong disbelief, and was after a period of considerable deliberation, chose not to share it with anyone outside her immediate family. The journal survived in fragments, because Clara's granddaughter could not quite bring herself to destroy. But it did not become public until much later, and by then the people it is read were long dead, and the world they had inhabited was gone, and the story told had the quality of something that had happened in a dream, fewer than subsistent impossibility for a belief. What Clara wrote in the winter of 1848 was this, Najma the watches refreeze. I do not think father understands how much she watches. I do not think anyone does, except perhaps Nor. And Nor does not speak of it. He sat at his subordinate and father asked him about the Easter fields, and he answered in a way that made father nod. And I thought, he knows more about this plantage than father does. He knows more about a Friesner her than her nieces. And I do not know what he intends to do with that knowledge. But I am more certain of this than I have been of almost a niece, that he intends something in Najma. She was right. And what intended was about become considerably more feasible. In March of 1848, Regent has to come back to Crefeld. He had not been infected. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, announced, rather at the long half no of life fox that led the man was there of a man who had decided that the time for bushes was over. He was accompanied by a lawyer from Beaufort, a man in big detail, who carried a laser satchel and who had the look of someone who had been told just enough about the situation to be useful and not quite enough to be comfortable. Howell Foster sees them in the parlor. He was calm. The household staff noted this afterward, the unusual quality of his calm, the sense that he had been expecting this visit and had prepared for it. He offered Hassock a chair and a glass of bourbon water. Hassock did not waste time. He told Howell Foss that he had decided to move forward with his rat, that he had inspected to prepare the necessary documents for failure with the county court, documents that would initiate a legal procedure based on the effect of Edmund Foss's fraudulent transactions. He told him that the procedure, once initiated, would be difficult to stop, and that the consequences for Crefeld would be severe. He told him that there was still time to avoid all of this, if Horolfos was prepared to be reasonable about the land. Horolfos listened to all of this. He said to his bird. He looked at Havtok with the same expression, that quality for most beauty, that he had shown his son in January. And then he said, I'd like you to meet someone. He called for Kato. Kato came into the parlor, not from its side, not from the courthouse, but from the study, where he had been deep in water. He was carrying a laser folder, and he sat down in a chair across from Havtok and Taft with the same composure that he brought to the freezer. What happened next took approximately 40 minutes. Kato led that, document by document, the full picture of Admit Foss's fraudulent transactions, not the fridge that Havtok had, based on his father's reputation, but the original records themselves, the actual falsified documents that Edmund Foss had in the courthouse and that Kato had been holding for years. He led them that with a prestige that made Taft, the lawyer, lean forward in his chair and put on his spectacles and look very carefully at what he was saying. And then Kato led it Samus race. He led it a set of documents that considered Reginald Havtok himself. Documents that described, in careful detail, the transaction that Havtok had mentioned to Horolfos in the study 2 years earlier, the transaction for the sale of enslaved birds from Havstok's holders at a bear in New Orleans, the transaction that had been recorded as voluntary but that had been, in fact, Samus release. What it had been, in fact, was a sale conducted in violation of a specific provision of South Carolina law, a provision that prohibited the sale of certain categories of enslaved people under certain circumstances, a provision that had been enacted in 1820 and that was, by 1848, still technically on the books, though rarely enforced. The violation was not trivial. It was the kind of violation that, if brought before the right court, could result in significant legal and financial consequences for the person who had committed. Kato had found the efforts of this violation the same as he had found the freeze reverse, in the fragments and ledger entries and offered conversations that he had collected for years. He had not known, when he first found it, that it would be useful. He had simply noted it and feed it away, because that was what he did with the freezer. Havtok looked at his documents for a long time. His face had gone through several changes during the course of Kato's presentation, surprise, then anger, then Samus that was no quite fear but was closer to. Taft, beside him, had said nothing at all. He was looking at Kato with an expression that was difficult to read, Samus between professional assessment and genuine astonishment. Where did you get these? Havtok said faintly. Kato looked at him. That's not relevant, he said. Havtok turned to Horolfos. Your corner let him speak to me like that. Horolfos looked at his class. He's speaking the truth, he said. It's not relevant. The silence that followed lasted a long time. It said, the marsh was quiet in the wet cotton reese burn, a wetter kind of quiet, the kind that preceded the return of the birds from the south. A mockingbird caught somewhere in the live ox and then was said. Havtok stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Kato one more time, a long look, the kind that was trained categories Samus that refused to fit into any fallible category, and then he looked at the burler was at another world. Taft followed him, clutching his satchel, his face carefully blended. They rode back down the ravine of live ox and did not return. The legal procedure was never failed. The land dispute was never resolved in Havstok's favor. And the story of what had happened is a burler at Crayfield on that Tuesday afternoon March of 1848 spread through the local train the careful, public way that stories spread in communities where citizens cannot be said directly, through publication first and the significant silences of people who had heard some of they were not sure they were supposed to have heard. What those people understood, without being able to articulate it precisely, was that Samus had shifted at Crayfield, Samus in the Palace of Sinners, and that the shift had been engineered by a man who was, by the free legal and social definition available in 1848, the property of the man he had just helped. The summer of 1848 was the hot of memory nasty, Alan Burge. The coat cruel, it always cruel in hate, as long as the rain came at the right intervals, but they had Samus at the people at Crayfield that the coat could not accommodate. It war atheism. It meant the nets long ran less celas, and the desfile like samsert be endured rather than left. We has had most of its routines was a kind of mechanical persistence, as the dinner table continued its strange neatly ritual, and the sailors around the continued hall. But Samus was chandiger. Thomas Foss had come back from Beaufort when Ifnarandley was a lock on his face that his mother recognized immediately, the look of a man who had heard Samus ran was the said rote dose. He had heard, at his tavern, a furge the story of what had happened was Hastok Mosh. The furge he had heard was incomplete and distorted, as the stories always were based in there had passed through enough masses, but the core of it was recognizable. He had heard that his father had used the Slafman to threat a neighbor. He had heard that the Slafman had built those documents. He had heard that Hastok had left without a word. He came home and went directly to his father's study. The conversation that followed was the longest and most consequential that Howell Foss and his son had ever had. It lasted most of the night. Larry whose room was adjacent to the study, heard fragments of it through the wall, not enough to reconstruct the whole, but enough to understand the general show. She wrote about it in her journal the next morning, in the careful, precise hand that had become her habit. Najm's father told Thomas Samus last night that I could not follow her. Thomas's face was lad at the first and then became coy, which is always more frightened than a dance. I heard him say near the end, I know what happens when he decides he wants more. And I heard father say, he won't. And Thomas said, how do you know? And father was quiet for a long time. And then he said Samus I could not make it. And then Thomas left. And I heard him go those stairs and at the front door. And he did not come back until morning the Najme. Thomas's question, what happens when he decides he wants more? Was the question that everyone at Crefeld had been Najme not Najme to ask for the better part of a year. It was the question that left in the sailors around the dinner table, in the careful foods of the frick, in the watchful eyes of nor in the kitchen. It was the question that the story was always circling, always about Schnur, always pulled back from. They answered that question, the real answer, the one that Howell Foss had given in the study that night, was Samus that Clara did not hear. But it was Samus that became clear, over the course of the following months, through its consequences. Howell Foss had begun, quickly and without an estimate, the process of Manimeterketo. Manimesh, the legal friend of an slave birth, was not impossible as Carlin in 1848, but it was not easy. This state had been steadily restricted as the conditions under which it could occur since the reboot of the century, and by the 1848 the process required a petition to the state legislature, a demonstration of exceptional circumstances, and the approval of a committee that was not inclined to look favorably on such requests. It was a process that could take years and that could fail at any point, and that was, in the current political claim, was the intentions of a rebuilder thought what would eventually become the case of the 1855, particularly fraud. Howell Foss had begun the process anyway. He had done it through a lawyer in Cholist, not Taft, who was a stocksman, but a different lawyer, a man named Cornelius Bernrakel, who had a reputation for handling complicated matters with distress. The petition had been filed quietly, without fanfare, and it had been worked out through the relevant channels for several months before a new one at Crefeld not existed. Cato no? He had known almost from the beginning. Bernrakel had sent a letter to Crefeld that had passed through the courthouse, and Cato had read it before forwarded it to the manhouse, as he read the phrases that passed through the courthouse. He had read it and said nothing, and had continued to bear at the dinner table every funny, and had continued to manage the plantation's affairs with the same quiet competence that had characterized the phrases he did. But something had changed in him after he read that letter, something that Clara noticed, though she could not have said exactly what it was, a quality of attention that had shifted slightly, a sense that the letter, which had defined him for so long, was an interface fine fuzz. The petition was approved in the spring of 1849. It was approved not because the committee was sympathetic to the principle of Manimesh, it was not, but because Howell Foss had made a case that was, not so no, as carefully constructed as a phrases that had happened at Crefeld over the past 2 years. He had argued that keto services the plantage of a nature that could not be adequately compensated within the existing framework, and that the arrangement currently in place, the dinner table, the management role, the access to the plantation's financial affairs, was created a situation that was, from a legal standpoint, ambiguous and was that could cause problems. He had argued, in other words, that management was at least solution a complicated problem. The committee had accepted this argument, with reservations, and the papers had been signed. On a موان April of 1849, Keto was legally free. He was 29 years old. He had been a slave for approximately 17 years. He had spent the last decade of those years constructed, with a bullish and a bullish that the describes the conditions of his own brush. He did not leave Crefid immediately. This was the detail that people found most difficult to understand in the years that followed, the fact that he stayed. He stayed for another 6 months, through the summer and into the autumn, continuing to manage the plantation's affairs, continuing to be at the dinner table, continuing to be, in all feasible respects, exactly what he had done before. The difference was that now he was abetted, not generously, the arrangement was not generous, but in actual money, a wage that was recorded in the plantation's ledgers and that Keto kept in a small box in the courthouse. In October of 1849, he left. He did not make an announcement. He did not have a conversation with Harold Foss about his departure, or if he did, no record of it surfaced. He simply bought what he owned, which was not much, and walked on the avenue of Fly Fox and did not come back. What happened to Keto after he left Crefeld is a matter of incomplete record. There is a man and Keto appears in the records of the free black community in Charleston ذري 185 a man who worked as a faculty division, handler and correspondence for several of the smaller trader houses on the waterfront. The records describe him as tall, precise in his manner, and exceptionally competent with figures. Whether this a man is impossible to say with certainty. The records do not perfect the surname, and the description, while consistent, is not inclusive. There is also a reference in a letter written by Cornelius Barnacle a colleague in 1853 a former client of unusual ability who had established himself in the commercial life of Charleston who had, in Barnacle's estimation, a clearer understanding of the workings of the city's financial arrangements than most men who have spent their entire lives within them. Barnacle does not name the man, but the team and the description suggestive. Beyond these fragments, the trial was called. Crefeld itself continued for another decade and a half, until the Civil War made the plantation economy of the low country impossible to stop. Howell Foss died in 1857 of a heart element that has doctor attributed the cumulative races of a lifespan managing a large agriculture operation a period of increasing political instability. Thomas Foss attempted to run the plantation after his father's death, but he lacked both the temperament and the knowledge that had for years resided primarily in the man who had sat at the dinner table and was known. ب 1861 Crefeld was stricken. ب 1865 it was finished. Margaret Foss lived until 1871. Claire married a man from Beaufort in 1855 and moved his family's property, where she continued to keep her journey until the end of her life. The journal passed her daughter, and then to her granddaughter, and then into the lane of a traveling trunk in attic, where it waited for 60 years. Then to Frick left Crefeld in 1855, the year after Keto's departure, and took a position as overseer on a plantation judge. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed at Crefeld. In a letter to his brother, read sometime ذري 185 and preserved in a family collection Safan, he wrote, Najme, I have seen sinners in the sort that I would not have believed possible, and the strangest of them was at a place in Beaufort district where a man did something that I still cannot entirely account for. I will not write it down, but I think about it. Najme. Nor remained at Crefeld until the end. She was freed by the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and she sat on the property for several years afterward, working for wages in the household of the family that had purchased Otterman of the plantation from Thomas Foss's creditors. She did in 1871, the same year as Margaret Foss, and was buried in the sole cemetery at the edge of the property where the Slavic community of Crefeld had buried his dead for 60 years. No one recorded what she thought about any of it. She had, as always, kept her own counsel. The county court has a record that might have provided a clearer picture of the legal procedures, the management, the have-stock dispute, the various financial transactions that Cato had navigated, were destroyed in a fear in 1879. The fear was officially attributed to a lamp left burned in the records room of Fernie. Several people who were left at the time expressed brief doubts about this explanation, but no investigation was conducted, and the matter was closed. What remained after the freeze was the question that Thomas Foss had asked his father on that hot night in 1848, through the whole of the study, will clever listened. Najma what happened when he decided he wants more Najma who Foss's answer, the one that clever had not been able to hear, was never recorded. But the fans that followed suggested what it might have been, because what Cato had wanted, from the beginning, was not Najma more. Najma had wanted exactly what he had planned for from the age of 15, was a patience and a precision that the world he left in had come from no choice but develop. He had wanted Najma at Najma, not revenge, not better offer the people who had held better offer him, not the satisfaction of what Crefeld fell, though it did fall, in the end, as all such a fell eventually. Just Najma. The Kaon. The dinner table, that fringe, sinister, inexplicable arrangement that had scandalized the neighbors and celeste the ministers and left to frequent cryptic letters 3 decades later, had been the brace of that freedom. A calculated brace, burdened by a knowledge and the careful management of other people's secrets. A brace that Cato had determined, years before anyone understood what was happening, was the one who was ultimate. Whether it was worth it, whether any of it was worth it, whether the years of waiting and watching and holding his knowledge like a stone has just or worth the freedom that came at the end of them, that is a question that the record does not answer. It cannot answer. The record is stone complete. The silence is too deep. The man himself took carefully asked from the documents that survive. But there is one more thing, one detail that Clara recorded in her journal on the morning after Cato left Crefeld, in October of 1849. She had watched him go from her window, had seen him although they have no fly fox in the morning light, carrying a small bundle, not looking back. She wrote, Najma, he did not look back. Not once. I watched until I was come from sea, and he never turned. I have been trained to decide what that means, and I think I have said. It means that he had already said goodbye to this place a long time ago. He was just waiting for his body to catch up. Najma. She closed the door. She did not write and take him for 3 days. And somewhere though they have no fly fox, in the early morning late of October then 1849, a man who had spent 17 years building the condition of his own freedom out away from the place that had held him and did not look back and was gone. What do you think of this story? Do you believe a freeze was field, or do you think there are leaders here that the record, deliberately or otherwise, chose not to preserve? Leave your comment below. The story of Cato and Crefeld is one that history swallowed almost whole, and the fragments that remain has more questions than the answer. If you want more stories like this, stories that live in the space between what we know and what we can only suspect, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves the kind of mystery that doesn't need the supernatural to be deeply, genuinely unsettling. We'll see you on the next.